Hello everyone and welcome to The Bubbling Adventure, a podcast all about kids and how educating them positively can impact their entire life as well as society. Each week we're having conversations with guests on different themes, and our aim is to have open discussions, share different points of view and learn in a non-judgmental way. Today we're welcoming Rachael Daniels, who is a forensic psychologist. She will tell us how much your childhood can have an impact on your life, relationships, and reactions. It's very interesting to take a step back and actually try to understand how your previous experiences affect the way you make decisions today. The best way to support this podcast is to subscribe if you haven't already and write a review if you're listening from Apple Podcasts. But without further ado, let's begin.
Maman, maman, en faisant cette chanson.
Papa, papa, en faisant cette chanson.
Maman, papa, maman, papa.
Hi Rachel, how are you?
Good, I'm good, Julie. Thank you. How are you?
Good, thank you for joining today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Of course. Could you please introduce yourself?
Of course, yeah. So I'm Rachael Daniels, and I'm currently working as a forensic psychologist in training. And I'm currently working in a forensic mental health hospital. So I suppose just explaining those complex words a little bit. A psychologist obviously understands the individual, trying to look at how they think, how they feel, and how they behave. And then in terms of the forensic part is trying to understand, why people are offended and, what makes them behave in that way and trying to support them with those needs. And yeah, I'm currently working in a mental health hospital, which means they're both have a offending history, but also mental health concerns as well.
Right, so young people in trouble and you're trying to understand exactly what happened and help them as much as you can.
Yeah, basically. A lot of the individuals that I work with have troubled pasts, and that has led them to engage in behaviours that are against the law, mostly kind of violence or sexual offences, and also led them to have, mental health problems such as like personality disorder or things like schizophrenia. And because of those two joint problems, they found themselves in a forensic mental health hospital. And yeah, my job is to kind of support them with their behaviour, their thoughts, their feelings, and try and change that behaviour so they can live, more fulfilling life, but also one that kind of abides by the laws.
Yes, so it's also benefiting society, I guess.
Yeah.
And so what brought you to be a forensic psychologist in the first place?
Yeah, so I've been asked this question a few times, and I think originally I would always say, kind of a standard kind of answer would be that I always really just enjoyed forensic programs. I remember as a kind of a young adolescent really enjoying programs like The Bill, which I'm not sure if you know about. Actually, it's just like a prison police program. But actually, looking back now, reflecting back onto my childhood, I remember actually I must have been about 7 or 8, and my auntie and uncle got burgled. And I remember kind of thinking well, why would anyone burgle somebody else? And I just didn't really understand. But I always remember wanting to understand and wanting to know why. And I think I always kind of reflect as well that I have quite a logical, mathematical brain. And I'm always trying to solve things and work things out. So I think even from that kind of young age, I always wanted to know, what would possess someone to engage in that kind of behavior, and kind of trying to understand why they would do that. And thinking about it now, I think my upbringing was quite different to that. I would say that I had quite a privileged upbringing. I wasn't living in a mansion or anything, but my parents were both together, could afford to send me to a good school, lived in a good area. And I think reflecting now, I was what makes somebody so different to that they would go into these measures to kind of burgle somebody else. And I think that always just kind of sparked my interest into people and then also offending behaviour. So that led me to go to university and study psychology and criminology.
Nice.
And while I was there, I also I worked in the police as a special constable.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so that gave me a bit more of an insight into it as well.
That's nice. So quite early on, well, before uni, you already knew what you wanted to do. So that's good, because a lot of people are still unsure, I think, at this age. So it's quite cool, and like it's very interesting actually. So what is it that you really love about it?
I suppose the thing like it kind of sounds a little bit generic in terms of every day is different, but I suppose the other thing is that, you know, I just find it fascinating to understand people, and I'm always trying to really like analyze and understand why someone behaves in that certain way. And I just find it really rewarding in terms of like improving people's like quality of life. So, and don't get me wrong, it's not huge changes. Sometimes it can be really small changes that you have to really look for. But yeah, just enhancing their life. And I think by working with the offender, you can then support more victims. So if you support one offender, that could save, you know, 10, 20 victims, say.
That's true.
So I always find that part rewarding. Yeah.
No, it's true. And so how does it work exactly? Because so when you're working with someone, how, you know, do they allocate a special amount of hours for special cases, or how, you know, like how is it? I don't know how it works exactly.
Yeah, so I suppose that's kind of our role. So as the psychologist, when someone, you know, you meet the person for the first time, really about doing a really comprehensive assessment. So really trying to understand what their risk is. So, you know, if their risk is of general violence, sexual violence, if they've got any risk to themselves, like self-harm or drug use or problems in relationships. You would then be looking at like what their need is. So what kind of therapy or treatment would best suit them, you know, what their motivation is, because a lot of people aren't even motivated to do any work. So you'd be looking at that as well. And then also if there's any kind of what we call responsivity needs. So if they've got a lower IQ, or if there's any concerns that you would also need to take into consideration. And then doing that comprehensive assessment allows us to understand what treatment is best for that individual.
Right. So even the initial diagnosis can take weeks, literally.
Oh yeah, weeks, years sometimes. Like I've got patients now. So
Wow.
there's quite a difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. So a psychiatrist is somebody that diagnoses and is like a doctor that prescribes medication. So they usually do the diagnosing. So they might then say that someone's got schizophrenia or they've got personality disorder. We can assist with that by doing assessments and supporting that clinical judgment, but we would normally work with the diagnosis rather than actually diagnosing. That's usually the psychiatrist. But yeah, I mean, those diagnoses take years, and people have different opinions. So I've got patients that, you know, have originally been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and then years later another psychiatrist thinks it's more kind of schizoaffective disorder. So just different elements and different people's perspectives.
I see. And so, yeah, is, for example, schizophrenia amongst the most common cases, or like what would be the thing that you see most of the time?
Yeah, so I suppose at the moment, most of my service users have paranoid schizophrenia, or they would have a personality disorder. So paranoid schizophrenia, they often hear like voices or see hallucinations or other delusions. And that can often result in them then being violent, because they're hearing something or seeing something that's not real, or they're believing something. And that can often result in them being violent. So they might believe that somebody's after them, or believe that they're, you know, someone's going to kill them. And actually they kind of attack in order to kind of protect themselves. So that's quite a common case.
I see, yes. And so how do you assist in these instances? Do you do some kind of exercises? Is it just like a talking therapy, or does it depend on the patient?
Yeah, so most of psychology is talking therapies, but it really does depend on the service user and how kind of well they are, and how kind of motivated they are to change. So if you have someone in that's still having those hallucinations, you know, they're not going to really want to be engaging in any treatment or even kind of understand what's going on, let alone wanting to do any therapy. So then you'd be working with a psychiatrist to provide medication in order to kind of support those symptoms. And then my job would be to kind of provide some stabilization therapies to try and make them as stable as possible, and then providing more advanced therapies such as like CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy, for hearing those voices. So trying to change their thoughts about those voices, and understanding that, you know, what they're perceiving is not in the real world,
Mm-hmm.
and making them feel less threatening.
Yeah, that must be tough. And I assume that you also have to really build trust at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of always say this, and I think that's, you can have all the kind of therapy knowledge and everything like that, but I think, I don't have a percentage, but I always kind of say around like 70% of it is around your relationship with them. Like, I just think building that trust, showing empathy, showing compassion is half the battle. I think a lot of the individuals come from homes where, they haven't had a stable upbringing. They maybe mistrust people. They feel like rejected and abandoned. So actually, a lot of my job is trying to actually break those and provide that care and that kind of validation and support.
Mm-hmm. So basically, the long-term goal is to have them get better and then slowly preparing them to go back to society and live a normal life.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, providing them enough therapy that they feel they're not going to be a risk to themselves or to others in the community, and then they can live in the community without, I mean, we're not going to solve all the problems. They might still hear voices, but that those voices wouldn't be at risk enough for them to harm themselves or others.
Right. And they would still have therapy, right?
In the community.
Yeah, they're not like completely just like outside without any boundaries. They would still have to come to therapy, right?
Yeah, so the ideal situation is that they then kind of have more and more freedom and less therapy, but that is kind of integrated back into community. So they'd have community mental health services involved when they're back in the community.
Right. Is there any patient that really, marked you and you want to share maybe like a story?
I suppose there's kind of a couple of people that have so personality disorder. So personality disorder is quite different to kind of mental illness, is in terms of like there's not medication or a magic wand that kind of support their disorder. So personality disorder is really, we all have a personality, but they have traits that are more problematic, and they affect their life in kind of pervasive ways. So yeah, there's a couple of patients that I've got that have quite severe personality disorders. So they go through all the treatment and they work on offence focused work. So they'll go through sex offender treatment programs for months, 18 months, 2 years, and then they come out the other side and they've completed the intervention, and they've learned the right words and they understand what the therapy was about. But how do we test that is actually worked? Because they can say the right words, but how do we test that actually that therapy has reduced their risk, especially if it's related to sexual violence? Because it's a huge risk to let somebody that's committed a sexual offence back into the community. And how do you really prove that, especially when they're still living in a hospital?
Yeah, so they maybe don't have all the triggers that you have outside, right?
Exactly. And that's what's so hard, is because you're in a team and you kind of have to make these recommendations and suggestions of what you do with somebody, obviously taking into account their ideas as well. But how do you really test those risks in a hospital environment? But also there's a lot of people that are very risk adverse. So you do get people that have, been in forensic hospitals for, I've got 2 patients that have been in for over 30 years.
Wow.
And I think the misconception is that actually sometimes that mental health hospitals are kind of the easy option. So I don't know if you've seen, on like the media stories, it'll say like someone's got diminished responsibility for murder, so they're sent to a mental health hospital rather than prison. Mm-hmm. And that's often seen in the media as like the easy way out. But actually, like in a prison sentence, you're given, say, 25 years, you serve 15, you have a date that you get out. Whereas when you're in a mental health hospital, the only way to get out is to prove that you're well. So it's a lot harder.
It can take even longer, yeah.
Yeah. I often put myself in their shoes and like, how do you prove that you're well enough to be released? Like, what kind of hoops do you have to go through to prove that? And especially when you're in a situation that's not the same as the community, how do you prove that you've learned enough to be released?
Yeah, that must be a very tough thing to decide, and also very time consuming.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so hard is that, like with these two guys that I'm talking about, that, you know, they've been in such a long time that a lot of people just kind of are that risk adverse and kind of say, well, you know, we don't know that they've changed, so we can't let them out. But then, you know, what happens then? Do they just stay in forever? So yeah, it's quite hard.
Yeah, it's not an easy job for sure.
No, and so they all have a psychiatrist that's their kind of what we call responsible clinician, and it's their decision to let them out. So, you know, we can make recommendations as the psychologist, but they're the ones that are fully responsible. So, you know, they can take on your opinion, but they're the ones that will get the backlash if anything happened. You know, if that individual was released and another offence occurred, the questions would be asked of why that person was released.
Yes. And I was also wondering actually like what life is inside. Do they have visitors? Do they have, you know, like kind of like a garden activities, or how does it work?
So in mental health hospitals, they're kind of given categories. So like kind of high, medium and low secure. So high security would have not much freedom at all. They have like no like access to cutlery and to kitchens and any kind of risk items because of their risk of violence. Usually they wouldn't have access to anything like that. I currently work on low secure, so they have access to the kitchen, they have a garden they can go to whenever they want, they all have their own bedroom with a kind of, I say ensuite, but it's not like a fancy hotel ensuite. It's you know, a stainless steel toilet and shower cubicle, but yeah, they all do have their own room. So in terms of that, compared with prison, you know, in prison a lot of people are sharing rooms with other people, so I suppose in terms of a mental health hospital, they, you know, do have a little bit more freedom as to some extent, and a little bit more luxury in terms of where they're staying.
But also, yeah, of course, you don't want to put the other patients in danger.
Exactly. Yeah. And I've had this conversation with other people in terms of like, again, you know, other people's perception of you know, prisoners is that, you know, why are they given TVs? Like, why do they have PlayStations and things? And I suppose my kind of thoughts around it is it's not a punishment within a punishment. They're in here because of something they've done wrong, and they're in here to kind of be rehabilitated. You know, part of having things like TVs and PlayStations is a reward based. So it's not to say that if they don't do something that they might lose that privilege, but if we didn't give them any privileges, it just feels so punitive. And also, how would we have anything to work with if they had nothing? You know, that would lead to like riots, and, you know, it'd be inhumane.
Yeah, so for example, if someone refuses to like participate in the sessions, you can basically like remove video games or TV.
Yeah, to some extent. I suppose it really depends on how needed that therapy is. So if I was saying that this therapy is needed in order to move forward, then we'd be looking at things that, you know, taking things away, but not in so much of a punitive way. So it'd be more like, you know, unless you engage in this therapy, you can't move forward. So you couldn't have things like unescorted leave. So unescorted leave is leaving the hospital on their own to go into the community for specific reasons and specific periods of time.
So this is for the low security, right?
Yes, mostly low security. Some medium have it, but mostly it's low security. So it might be that, you know, an individual has 3 hours per week, 1 hour to go shopping, 1 hour to, you know, go for a walk, and another hour for something else. And that would be stopped if they weren't engaging in the, you know, work that was needed to reduce their risk.
And did you ever have a case where they tried not to come back?
No, I actually haven't. When I worked in a prison before, I was working there at the time, but I wasn't actually on shift. And he only had 2 days left of his sentence, and he was I think he might have gone to hospital. He only had 2 days left, and he opened the door and ran for it. But they caught him pretty quickly. But yeah, he actually got an extra 4 months, I think, for that. So
yes, of course.
It wasn't the smartest idea, bless him. But yeah, no, I suppose the guys I'm working with at the moment, they're all kind of really engaging in their treatment. often been there a long time and they've worked their way down to low security. So I suppose for them, you know, running away just wouldn't be worth it, and they can kind of see that.
Yes.
But it's definitely a risk. It's definitely something we have to think about.
Yes, for sure. And yeah, like what you do if they don't come back. And yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, so your job is really to understand what happened in their life and, you know, like what led them here, what happened exactly. And so,
Yeah, definitely.
you know, it's the famous question, nature or nurture. So I think you have a lot of things to say about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, I mean, this is a question that's always asked of psychologists, and I remember even being asked it at like A level and stuff. But I suppose we all have like nature kind of traits, you know, we all have a personality traits, we all have temperament, you know, whether we're a bit more sociable, a bit more shy, a bit more passive. And we all have like genetical differences as well. And I think that obviously plays an impact, like that impacts in the way we deal with stress, the way we deal with traumatic experiences. That might make us a bit more sensitive to trauma. It might make us a bit more vulnerable. But, you know, I think that's one part of it. But I think, you know, hugely, I can't think of many patients in my whole time that haven't gone through some kind of traumatic experience or like psychological factor. So like, you know, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. So anything we call kind of like adverse childhood experiences. So something in childhood that's gone wrong, that's been traumatic for them, and that the way their needs have not been met. So they have to create these kind of coping strategies to deal with that. And I honestly can't think of many patients that haven't had that kind of history.
And sometimes it must be very hard as well to identify and like really have them talk about exactly what happened to them, I guess, because also we know with trauma some people even forget, like they really have no recollection of what happened because, you know, they're like being protected.
Yeah, they haven't actually processed it.
Exactly. I think it must be tough and to just like go super deep until you figure out. And for most of them it must not be like just one thing, but then more like a succession of events that led them where they are.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the main difference. I've worked like with children, so, you know, adolescents that are kind of like 15 to 18, and now I work with adults, and I find that when working with children, you know, the trauma is a lot more raw. It's happened, you know, probably within the last 10, 12 years. So they're able to recall that a lot more. And also they haven't been in services and, you know, talked to therapists about their trauma over and over again. So they're actually a lot more kind of engaging to talk about it, and like you can almost have that kind of like you're the first person to talk about the trauma and help them, you know, to kind of process that. Whereas working with adults, you know, I'm working with people that are like now 50 and their trauma was like 40, 50 years ago. And, you know, they've gone over that with so many different psychologists and psychiatrists and everyone else who's asked about it, that actually like even their memories of that is blurred now. And the trauma is so long ago, it's so hard to work with someone where, yeah, the trauma's happened so long ago and it's affected their whole life. Because, you know, when that traumatic experience has happened, and they've dealt with that in the best way possible, but that's often led to what we call like maladaptive coping strategies. So, you know, coping strategies, but that are not the most sociable or positive. So things like self-harm, substance misuse, and that's then been ingrained for, say, 45 years. So it's very hard to work with someone and try and undo all that.
Of course, because also if you say something so many times, actually it loses meaning. You know, it's like...
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
That must be very challenging.
Yeah.
But then also very, you know, inspiring and fulfilling as a job. Because then you really make a difference. You're helping people who really need help.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the most rewarding thing, is to kind of work with somebody that you know has had this kind of pretty horrific upbringing, and, you know, throughout their whole lives then led to different problems. And, you know, I suppose I always have the kind of mindset that, you know, somebody doesn't want to have that lifestyle. A lot of people kind of think, well, they chose that life and they chose to commit the crimes. But, you know, I always kind of think, well, actually it was their, you know, their upbringing and what led them to do that. You know, they want to have a good life. They've just gone around it in kind of antisocial ways.
yeah, I think it goes way deeper than just choice, and it's more also just, I can imagine, because it's also linked for some of them, I guess, for, education, and how
Mm-hmm.
also when you don't have, for example, a good example,
Mm-hmm.
then, I mean, you must like want to react some way. And I guess right or wrong is blurred from the beginning.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, like especially, so I used to work in a prison for young people. So yeah, they were like, I think they could have been up to 12, but mostly we got about 15-year-olds. I remember one of them, I spoke to her mum, and she was literally like, oh, what you mean now she's in prison, I won't get her disability funds? Like, and she was kind of more upset that she wouldn't get the funding for the disability rather than her daughter of 15 years old has just gone to prison. So, when you're like, what kind of upbringing was that, like for her mum to not care that she's now in prison at 15, what kind of life did she have? And at that age to have already committed quite a serious violent offence, what kind of upbringing did she have?
But that's tough.
And who's really responsible for that?
Exactly. And yeah, I think sometimes it must be hard also so for some of them, they've been doing some horrible things, but then
Mm-hmm.
can you really blame them? Like, I don't know. It's such a tough question because, yeah, obviously it wasn't right, but I guess also sometimes
Mm-hmm.
in their mind, they wanted to do right, they just didn't know how to.
Exactly. Yeah, like they're a child at the end of the day. Like I mean, I remember another guy that took his children to go shoplifting, and his children were 6 years old. So by the age of 6 they were already committing thefts from shops with their father. So they were taught that was right. They don't have moral development at that age, so for them that was right.
No, and also, I mean, you trust your parents, your sticks.
Yeah.
It's even, even after, sometimes it's hard to not to trust your parents. So I guess, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really interesting is that so the age of criminal responsibility changes in different countries. So a lot of European countries are a lot older. I think Norway is like 16, but in England and the UK it's 10. So anybody over the age of 10 can be found criminally responsible for an offence. So if someone commits an offence at 10, it's nothing to do with their parents. We don't prosecute the parents. We prosecute the child at 10.
And there are no, like investigations or.
I mean, there would be like social services would be involved, and of course look into like the upbringing of the child, and if anything needed to be into that. But the responsibility is still with that child if they are over 10.
And so does this investigation, and like if the parents are found sort of responsible, is that influencing the decision?
No. So it's literally solely on the child's responsibility if they're over 10.
Okay.
Yeah. So interesting.
Yeah, interesting. And so is there any advice that you would like to share?
I suppose going into psychology, it's a long journey, but for me, I think it's worth it. I think it's about, get all the experience you can and kind of getting those voluntary jobs and trying to really understand different service users and their experiences. In terms of general advice, I suppose, it's about being compassionate to others, trying to understand rather than just judge. You never know what someone's gone through. And usually, always, if someone behaves in a certain way, there's a reason for that. And I suppose I really recommend reading around like the adverse childhood experiences. Anybody, would benefit from having information around, what are adverse childhood experiences and how do they impact on individuals' development, not just psychologists.
Yes, actually, I wanted to ask, like, how can we recognize that someone might need help?
I suppose looking at what their behavior is and trying to understand, like, if someone doesn't do something that we would typically define as normal, is trying to understand why and then signposting them to different support networks. So, the NHS provide what's called IAPT, so psychological therapies for people with depression, anxiety, and just signposting to different like psychological support. But I suppose, in terms of all of us, just looking at people's behaviour and trying to kind of understand and be compassionate towards them and signpost.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much. It's giving me a lot of things to think about now. But it's very interesting actually. And yeah, I think we should all try to, go deeper
Yeah,
and not just assume we know what they've been through and they just chose their like the way
chose
they
that
live their
life.
life, and
Yeah,
there are like so many other aspects that are mixed together, and it's very very confusing. So
yeah.
yeah, interesting.
Mm,
Well, thank you so much for joining.
thank you. No, thank you for having me, Julie. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening. Feel free to share if you think it might be helpful to someone you know. If you enjoyed this episode, then please make sure to write a review if you're listening on Apple Podcast, and subscribe if you haven't already. That's it from me. See you soon with the next episode, and in the meantime, have a lovely day.